Malubakanyesu kondolwayo izwa imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikelela thina nosapho lwayo Nkosi sikelele Afrika Malubakanyesu kondolwayo izwa imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikelela thina nosapho lwayo
So good evening. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Stewart Ting Chong, and I want to first of all acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Matakisa tribe of Massachusetts, the Indian Nation, the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapoag, and the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. I was born in Port Elizabeth, now called Kabeja, a port city in Nelson Mandela Bay. In the area between Cape Town, that you see on the left, and Kabeja, this whole area, a particular language, a black language is spoken in South Africa, and that language is Xhosa. I'm not going to teach you how to pronounce Xhosa right now, but I do want to teach you a Xhosa greeting. So, molo is the Xhosa word for hello. And to greet a group of people, I would say morweni, plural. And in South Africa, the black community is very family focused. So if there was somebody that was older than I was, I would call them mother or father, and I would say molo tata, molo mama. And if it was somebody of my generation, I would call them brother and sister. So I'd say molo buti, molo sisi. So for a group like this, because it's multiple people, I would say molweni nonke. And you would respond molo buti. So do you want to try that out? Molo nonke. Now, if you were a true South African, you would elongate those words and you would say molo buti. So, see, you speak Xhosa. So throughout my presentation, I'm going to be using terms that may seem derogatory, but those terms were used during apartheid South Africa, and there will be images of violence, but that's what we faced during apartheid. Apartheid laws formed the foundation and structure of institutionalized or systemic racism and discrimination, which caused many, including myself, to ponder two very complex questions. Who am I? What am I? And let me share some of these laws, because without understanding the implication of those laws, you will not appreciate the corrosive and soul-destroying impact of apartheid and the long-lasting damage of discrimination for generations of South Africans. So the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, passed in 1949, did not allow marriage between persons of different races. My wife and I would have been arrested and thrown in prison. The Immorality Act of 1950 made sexual relations with a person of a different race a criminal offense. The Group Areas Act put an end to diverse areas and determined where one lived according to race. Each race was allocated its own area, which was used in later years as a basis for forced removals. It forced families who lived in the same house for multiple generations into areas not of their choosing, often desolate areas. My family had land appropriated, and the house that I grew up in, there's now a Coke factory built on it. There's stories of elderly men who were born in that house, who were forced to move, and they actually committed suicide rather than leave. Under the 1950 Population Registrations Act, each inhabitant of South Africa was classified into several different race groups, of which white was one. Many criteria, both physical and social, whether you ate with your hands, what language you spoke, were used when someone was classified as white or colored. Colored, by the way, is an official racial classification still used in South Africa today, and is a term used to reference people of mixed race, often the result of white employers' unwanted advances on their black female workers. One mind-boggling test conducted to determine race was based on physical attributes, and that was called the pencil test. Has anybody heard of that? The pencil test was when an official, a government official, would take a pencil and stick it through your hair. And if that pencil remained in your curly hair, you were classified as colored or non-white. The black community was relocated mainly to an area of sand dunes where nothing grew, living in one-roomed wooden iron shacks, having to share communal toilets and outdoor water faucets. There was, and still is, no public transport to those areas. Many of the black community, because of the apartheid system, were forced into manual labor. Women became housemaids, often called, or most likely called, the girl, regardless of who was addressing her. So you would get young white people saying, "Where's the girl?" Men became laborers, referred to as the boy, earning a meagerly hourly rate without any benefits. This is Khayelitsha, with a population in 2020 of 2.4 million people, in an area just over 21 square miles. This is but one township. Townships were areas classified for blacks only. Outside of Cape Town, there's Nyanga, Gugulethu, Langa, all large black communities, all as impoverished. In comparison, Norwell has a population of 11.2 thousand people living in an area just over 21 square miles. For those of you fortunate enough to visit a very beautiful South Africa, spare a thought for the people who work in your hotel, who clean your rooms, always with a smile. Hello, sir. Hello, madam. And the effort that they've had to make to serve you. Everyone from the age of 16 had to carry an ID book, also called the Book of Life. And in that Book of Life was your birth certificate, the photos of yourself as you aged and changed, your driver's license, medical information, illnesses, marriage certificates, details of divorce, gun licenses, your voting record, your postal and residential addresses, and your death certificate, your Book of Life. One key factor in this ID book was one's personal ID, very much like the Social Security number here in the US, but with a difference. Because embedded in that ID number was the structure of apartheid. And here's my ID book. The first numbers was your date of birth, year, month, day. The next 4 sets of numbers were your gender. So women received a number between 0 and 5,000, males from 5,001 through to 9,999. This number represented whether you were a South African or born in South Africa or a resident from overseas. So I was an 04, born in South Africa. The 4 represented your racial classification. So I was a 4, South African Chinese. The last number is just a checksum to ensure the integrity of that ID number. And here's the key number listing of how everyone was racially classified. This classification determined who you went out with, who you married, what school you could attend, what education you received, and therefore what vocation you would enter and where you would live. Ironically, because of the huge trade agreements, Japanese in South Africa were classified as honorary whites. Griquas make up the indigenous Khoisan groups of South Africa, often regarded as the First Nation in South Africa. And I have to break and say that the Khoisan groups were mercilessly persecuted by the British. They were hunted on horseback. Whoops, sorry. So this represents the hierarchical structure reflecting the status and population ratio of each racial group around 1960. And it formed a pecking order reinforcing racial discrimination imposed through law. So you would have 20% of the white population governing 80% of the non-whites in South Africa during apartheid. Amongst the 80%, you would have Indians, Asians, coloreds, Chinese were part of that, and then the largest population of black, and each level discriminated against each other. Indians discriminated against Asians, Asians discriminated against coloreds and Indians, as well as blacks. And of course, the whites discriminated against everybody else. And this is how racial laws pitted each community against one another. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act was the legal segregation of public services. Each area was reserved for a particular race, creating, amongst others, separate beaches, separate buses, separate hospitals, schools, and universities. Blacks were provided with services greatly inferior to whites, as well as the Asian, colored, and Indian communities. So they were at the very bottom. I was born in a colored hospital, couldn't go to a white hospital. I went to a Chinese-only beach and attended a private Chinese school, paid for by the Taiwanese government. Again, each layer down has had less quality of service and education. And these are just some of the signs that I grew up with, signs that were in every public place. The apartheid government implemented further laws to segment the population. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 created the legal racial separation of education in South Africa. A separate system of education was crafted for black South African students that was designed to prepare black people for lives as a laboring class. And if you remember when I spoke, I said most of the men and women were laborers because that's the education they received, and they couldn't progress any further. My own dream as a young person was to become a veterinarian, until I discovered that the only university offering this degree, the Onderstepoort Veterinary Institute, was for whites only. I ended up attending a university to become, like most Asians, an accountant that took on non-whites on a quota basis. And this is how the apartheid government regarded blacks. There is no space for him, the native, in the European community above certain forms of labor. For this reason, it is to no avail for him to receive training which has its aim in the absorption of the European community where he cannot be absorbed. Until now, he has been subjected to a school system which drew him away from his community and misled him by showing him the greener pastures of European society where he is not allowed to graze. Where he is not allowed to graze. And I'd like you to, just in the back of your mind, remember this person, Hendrik Verwoerd. The predominant language of whites and the apartheid government in South Africa was Afrikaans. The education department of that time oversaw the implementation of Afrikaans and English as a dual medium of instruction in secondary schools, regardless of the locally spoken language, and some exams were also written in Afrikaans. I too was taught Afrikaans at school. On June the 16th, 1976, black school children in Soweto, outside of Johannesburg, protested the use of Afrikaans because they wanted to learn in their native languages. Amongst those protesting was 12-year-old Zolile Hector Peterson. Oops. Sorry about that. That wasn't good. He and others were shot and killed when the police opened fire. News photographer Sam Nzima photographed the mortally wounded Peterson being carried by another Soweto resident, Mbuyisa Makubo, while Hector's sister, then 17, ran beside them. This photo was published around the world. Mbuyisa allegedly fled South Africa for Nigeria. but has not been seen since that day, and his mother died without ever knowing what happened to her son. In the land of my birth, I cannot vote, whereas a young person of 18 can vote. And why? Because he or she possesses that wonderful biological attribute, a white skin. Desmond Tutu. After graduating as an accountant, I became painfully aware of the impact of discriminatory laws on communities and, more importantly, our psyches. So I returned to the questions when I started. Who am I? What am I? I think that Archbishop Desmond Tutu sums up the impact of apartheid in his interview when he was asked, "What was the worst thing about apartheid?"
What was the worst thing about apartheid?
Ultimately, it's actually when it makes you doubt that you are a child of God. When you are subjected to treatment that begins to work in here, and you begin to say, hey, maybe they are right. Language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. And so when we call you a non-European, a non-this, you might think it isn't working on you. But in fact, it is corrosive of your self-image. You end up wondering whether you are actually as human as those others.
I remember the Archbishop speaking about needing to explain to his daughter why she couldn't go into a park and play with the other young white kids on the swings. When he and his wife Leah went to King's College in London, they would purposely ask for directions, even though they knew where they needed to go. They asked just to be called Sir and Madam, where their dignity and humanness was acknowledged. In 1986, I worked as a systems analyst for a company in South Africa that was incredibly racist. The CFO and staff referring to black men as boys and worse, using a derogatory term, kafir, that would be similar to using the N-word here in the US. Looking back now, this was a positive event in my life, as it ignited my drive to fight for human rights and social justice. And I left that job to enter the priesthood in a very vocal and socially active Anglican Church. In 1987, I was asked to implement a digital communication system in Southern Africa that covered Namibia, Swaziland, Lesotho, South Africa, and at that time, Mozambique. That was 37 years ago when email was just making an appearance here in the US. Little did I know that my office would be part of the offices at Bishop's Court, Cape Town, the official residence of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and that I would become part of his personal staff. The Archbishop at the time had received his Nobel Peace Prize in 1984 and had an international platform to call for non-violent protest and economic, sports and entertainment sanctions. ANC leaders like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu were either in exile or imprisoned, so he was not only a person of moral authority, but here was a high-profile black person with an international platform. Not surprisingly, the apartheid government regarded him as an enemy of the government. We had a private network linking the Anglican Communion Office based in London, the Episcopal Church of the USA in New York, the Lutheran Federation, and the World Council of Churches in Geneva, that formed hubs to disseminate our communications. Remember, there was no Twitter, no Facebook, no TikTok at that time. The government owned all of the national newspapers and the radio stations, and during the state of emergency, barred the international press from areas of political unrest. So agencies like Reuters, Associated Press, Agence Française were recipients of our postings of anti-apartheid protests. A pinnacle moment in the history of CPSANet was related to a time when the Archbishop and his wife Leah and other church leaders were arrested, and that was September the 2nd, 1989, for an illegal protest march as a result of police beating of clergy and church workers during an earlier anti-government protest. I remember being in the top floor of the cathedral in Cape Town, and we had prepared a communique that would go out to the Episcopal Church in New York. They had set up a 24/7 system where they would be waiting and monitoring for my communication. And they in turn would disseminate that worldwide. The Archbishop was preparing to leave the cathedral with other church leaders, and the cathedral was surrounded by police with rifles, batons. They had police dogs. We had razor wire, not barbed wire, around the whole perimeter of the cathedral. There were armored vehicles, helicopters flying overhead. There was a huge truck with a water cannon placed on top of it. And they were ready for warfare against clergy. The Archbishop continued his march, and as expected, he and his wife Leah were arrested, put into police vans, and I sent off that communication. And within about 10 to 15 minutes after I'd sent that off, the South African apartheid government received notices of protests, at that time mainly faxes, from world leaders around the world. On a personal level, his staff became targets for security police surveillance. My own phone was tapped. ANC member and now retired Constitutional Court Judge Albie Sachs lost an eye and an arm in a car bomb attack. So we had to actually check under our cars before we drove them. There was an Anglican priest, or there is an Anglican priest, Michael Lapsley, who lost an eye and both hands in a parcel bomb attack. And all mail delivered to the Archbishop's offices had to be x-rayed. I remember one rather embarrassing moment when I had ordered some equipment, computer equipment, and forgotten to tell the office, and they had this parcel arrive and they x-rayed it, and they saw this metal object with a jumble of wires. And the Archbishop's offices were evacuated. So that's a little embarrassing. I have a brother living in the same town I was living in. I never visited him for probably 6 years. When he asked me why I didn't come around, I said to him, I cannot implicate you in the things I'm doing. Your family is going to be under surveillance. I never told my family what I did either. All they knew is that I worked on the computer systems for the Archbishop. I represented the office of Archbishop Desmond Tutu as one of the founding members of the Joint Forum on Policing to police the police. The group was formed together with key members of non-government organizations and faith-based groups. I also co-chaired the Human Rights Committee of South Africa in the Western Cape, and has previously shared by Zoe, privileged to have participated in the Bill of Rights for South Africa's Constitution. Another group where I represented the Archbishop was the Network of Independent Monitors, where we were involved in conflict resolution and mediation, often standing between protesters and the police as human barricades, bearing the brunt of tear gas and police shootings, negotiating with security forces and protesters, and acting as paralegals to help the Black community lodge complaints of police brutality. We trained the Black community to recognize the different types of long guns and police vehicles for more accurate reporting. For the Black community, everything was a long gun. And so they couldn't describe whether it was an R14 or R15, I don't know what those, or whether it was a shotgun, whether it was, some type of automatic weapon, and the same with police vehicles. One incident, and I don't even know whether, I think my wife knows about this. I was actually shot with a rubber bullet where we were standing between the police and protesters, and the protesters started breaking shop windows, and somebody on the police side panicked, opened fire, and we were still stuck in the middle. At the lead up to the first democratic election, I was the Archbishop's liaison with the United Nations and the European Union monitors. I'd like to share one event that I remember vividly, protesting whites-only beaches. There was a beach for whites, there was a beach along the coast, mainly rocky, for Indians, Chinese, and coloreds, and the blacks didn't have any beach. So the church moved into a phase of peaceful protest as part of what they call their defiance campaign, with the slogan of Christians defying unjust laws. And whites-only beaches became one such target. One weekend was identified where the churches decided to have family picnics on certain white beaches. So on Saturday, August the 19th, 1989, families arrived, whites, Indians, coloreds, blacks, arrived on a whites-only beach to picnic and enjoy what any family would do. Swim in the ocean, swim in the ocean, have a picnic, play ball, build sandcastles. And the police response was to use helicopters to whip up sand into people's faces. And the day ended with crowds being dispersed by the police with whips and dogs. A woman priest with clerical collar was whipped across her back that left open bleeding welts. A male priest, again with clerical collar, had a police dog set on him and was badly bitten. The following day, the Sunday, undaunted, the churches returned to the beaches. And the Archbishop instructed the crowds that had gathered to disperse and go home after the police threatened to open fire with live ammunition. All of this to protect a stretch of sand to prevent access to non-whites. September the 14th, 1989, saw one of the largest illegal anti-apartheid demonstrations in modern South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu led about 20,000 people of all races into the downtown streets of Cape Town. You can just about see the Archbishop here. And if you look, there's another handsome guy. From there on, we witnessed the release of Nelson Mandela after 27 years in prison. And I was finally able to cast my first vote in my life on the 27th of April, 1994, when I was 35 years old. I left my position with the Archbishop after 7 years when he was selected to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It is necessary to heal the wounds of the past if you are going to build your country and to have unity. I'm working with people who fought me very bitterly before the elections. It was my responsibility as the man who is leading the majority party, my responsibility to heal the wounds of the past and to work with people who were my opponents. Nelson Mandela. These words truly reflect the magnanimity of this man. He met with his former jailer. He invited the widows of former government apartheid leaders for lunch at Tuinhuis, his official home. Remember the name of that person that I asked you to remember. He invited the widow of that person who was the architect of apartheid. She was 94 years old at the time, Betsy Verwoerd. Betsy lived in Oranje, an enclave of Afrikanerdom. She declined his offer politely and said that she was too frail to travel to Cape Town. However, if he was in the area, he could stop by for tea. And what did this man do? He arrived in his helicopter and had tea with Betsy Verwoerd. The statesmanship and demonstration of grace, I believe, prevented South Africa from becoming a potential bloodbath. The Commission received more than 7,000 amnesty applications, held more than 2,500 amnesty hearings, and granted 1,500 amnesties for thousands of heinous, unimaginable crimes committed during the apartheid years. Crimes of torture, murder, One case was where a security policeman demonstrated how he would torture his victims. I'm sorry, this. And they would handcuff the victim, hands behind the back, feet tied, face on the ground, and he would sit on the victim's back, put a plastic bag over the victim's head, and pull back, straining the back this way, at the same time suffocating the victim. There was another case where the victims were tortured and eventually murdered, and their bodies were burnt. And while the bodies were being burnt, the torturers had a barbecue nearby. They then took the remains of whatever was left and threw it into a river. The bodies were never found. And I think, like most cultures, one of the critical things was to get the body back for burial. I still wonder what goes through the minds of such people. How do they come home to a family, to a wife and kids, and the wife says, "How was your day?" What goes through their psyche? I'd like to close by addressing the same two questions. Who am I? What am I? To be honest, I don't know. I see myself as a work in progress, even at my age. But I know that my life experiences allows me to share an empathy for women's rights. For what does it say about our society when mainly white men determine a woman's decision on her reproductive health? Is that any different to white racists determining my future during apartheid? Even now, some politicians are advocating a total ban on abortions, even for rape and incest, with some states going to the extreme by banning IVF treatment and the abortion pill. I stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement, for the LGBTQIA community, for the homeless, for those amongst us who face discrimination, just because of who they are. I would hope that I've grown to become a little more whole, someone who can draw on experiences with the ability to recognize humanity in others. This is an ongoing struggle when I see the political landscape today. You can perhaps understand, after hearing about my life growing up with apartheid laws, how incredibly outraged I was when 3 years ago the US president, at the height of the coronavirus, referred to the coronavirus as the China virus, making Asians around the world targets for discrimination. He actually repeated this term on the 18th of July this year. Memories of years of living in apartheid came flooding back then and now, for such emotional scarring never truly heals. Racist attitudes have no place in our society today. And everyone who has experienced discrimination in one form or another still carries scars, some memories still festering. And in my case, comments like China virus and comical pronunciations of Asian names or sounds meant to imitate the Asian language bring back those memories. But I'm constantly challenged through the examples that were set by those who suffered so much more than I. Racist attitudes exist and are becoming more blatant and prevalent today. One sitting governor went so far as to say that blacks benefited here in the US from slavery. In Virginia Beach, the seller of a condo wanted to withdraw from a $749,000 sale because the buyer, a molecular biologist, was black. The Democratic VP, a child of Jamaican and Indian marriage, is now being questioned on whether she is Indian or black. Why is race now a criteria for anyone's competency to be president of a country? And while on the subject of being Indian, this past month has seen an outpouring of hate from the far right over the wife of Republican Vice President nominee J.D. Vance. The unremarkable fact that Vance is married to Usha, a woman of Indian heritage, has become a fixation for white nationalist influences online. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Desmond Tutu. What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we led. Nelson Mandela. These are three quotes that have been my mantra for many years, spoken by the heroes that I've had the privilege to meet. So what is your reaction to a person of color? I recall the Archbishop saying how amazed he was when at a young age he was walking in the streets of Soweto with his mother, and a tall white priest doffed his hat. That priest was Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, who later became his mentor. Should we not develop the ability to look at someone as if to say, I see you, and I see you. I acknowledge your existence. I acknowledge your humanity. Regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of culture, regardless of religion, regardless of dress, regardless of status. So my challenge to you today is, what are you doing to make a difference in our society? What small action are you prepared to do? Small actions as simple as picking up some trash to save the environment for the generations to come. Perhaps you're packing parcels for unhoused migrant families or serving meals in homeless shelters. Let's try and do something that doesn't just enrich and benefit our lives. Where do you stand when you witness injustice? I believe that the time for passive support has reached its end, and we need to challenge our comfort boundaries. We need to regard the privilege of voting as sacred. With my history, I know that I do. We should not be complacent through our belief that the state of Massachusetts will always remain relatively liberal. Right now, we are under a very real threat of extreme conservatism and right-wing bigotry that reeks of the stench of racism and discrimination. Many refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of the sitting president and a Supreme Court making decisions that defies precedent. Sorry, my alarm's still going off. We have justices in the Supreme Court accepting lavish gifts, and one whose wife actively engaged in overturning the outcome of the last presidential election. We have white supremacist groups marching in the streets, tearing down gay flags and burning them. We have migrants, men, women, and children, becoming sacrificial political chess pieces. What is happening to our humanity and our moral compass that we can treat humans in that way? The political climate here has emboldened bigots to infiltrate key pillars in our society and given them a platform for their discrimination and hate. Do we ignore what's happening just because it's in somebody else's town and only react when it reaches our town? We cannot remain isolated in our peaceful bubble because discrimination and hate will permeate the safe worlds that we try and create. I hope that we can begin by making this town more inclusive, more welcoming to all. We need to challenge what we see and hear and make a stand for our belief in a more just society. I cannot help but remember the poem First They Came by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So I urge you to vote this November, to vote with your conscience, to vote with your moral compass. Our world needs to be better. Our state needs to be better. Our towns need to be better. You and I need to be better. Thank you.